do you want me to record it? I think they were going to put out it.
It's like,
Yeah, never used it. There's plenty of it. All right. And then live, you're doing live. There, you don't want me to bother with that one?
I don't know, I have to
Okay. All right, just tell me when I'll serve it.
I'm going to try to make it sound like, okay.
I guess they're really cute. Oh, they're doing fine.
Can you fit all of
No, it's left. All right, I'm going to start recording.
Ready, everybody? Yes. I push myself up against the wall. I can see you.
And it's good for your back.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, yeah, we're recording and we're going. So they can just go. What are you trying to do? Yeah, let me see something. I have to do it that, like it can't be this good to that. So I have to see first.
So
Danine, are you already in on that one?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know what the volumes of this? Yes. Okay. I'll wait till she does. So we're gonna test the audio. The only thing is we can't test it from ours because that's the one putting it out. So we just have to hear from your end that it's.
So should I hit start?
Yes. Open to mediums. Okay. You
Got it.
got it. You
Press
don't
speaker.
need. I'm trying to think. You don't need audio. I don't think you. We're gonna test the audio right now. Okay.
Check. You should see it coming up on the mic indicator. Here. 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Okay, what? Okay. Okay, good.
It says it's a practice session, start webinar.
You can, let's first, how do we set, I want to set this camera to be the main camera. View, gallery. It's up to you guys if you want this other. You can have it where there's no, like this camera's off.
Yeah, we don't need it because we want
Okay.
the PowerPoint
Stop
to
it
be viewed.
Okay.
anyway,
This is ours.
this place in the state.
It's fine, right now.
You want to pin it so that it's the main one?
Here to the north, it sounds
It's fine.
Okay. Alright, so I can shut off gallery view when I go back to speaker. Okay, so then you'll be like just off like where everybody else is, but you have control.
How do I get the PowerPoint back on for them?
The PowerPoint back on for
Yeah,
them?
because they need the PowerPoint slides to be viewed. We need to kind of like shut down the webinar while we're on.
So,
It's minimized, so.
oh, it's minimized?
Yeah, so we just have to
Hold on.
close that out.
We can do back to video and switch maybe. Oh, maybe it's one of these?
No, it's actually shutting down.
Okay, hold on.
There you go.
So it's,
And there.
oh, it's in here?
Perfect. And then we have to do from beginning. And then let's see if that works. And we need to view that.
But then what I'm going to say though is you can't control the chat while in here.
That's okay.
Okay.
They're going to do the performance, and then when we get to Q&A, I'm going to come back up here
Okay,
and
but
open
just
that
as a
up.
heads up, that will be on the screen behind it afterwards.
After, oh, that's fine.
Okay, okay. All
Yeah,
right, just making
thank
sure.
you.
Okay, so that's up. That's fine then. Let's go see. Can I just check one thing before you start?
Perfect. It's working. Okay.
Can I just make sure I didn't put the video back on? No, I just want to. We don't want that. That's all. And we're gonna go back to speaker view. Okay, now you can do what you're gonna do. She won't be able to put that on this, basically. The only right now is what we have. So you could probably just zoom this out. Okay.
Ben, is Lauren admitting people? And
It says 4 attendees.
okay, perfect. Thank you. You let me know when I should begin. I want. Okay. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Danine Jackson, and I serve as the project director for the Smithsonian Museum's Museum on Main Street, Voices and Votes, Democracy in America. I also serve here as the director of the new Wellness Center at Brookdale. Before I introduce tonight's special guest performance, I'd like to acknowledge the New Jersey Council for the Humanities for inviting Brookdale and in collaboration with the Monmouth Museum to host a very special Smithsonian traveling exhibit entitled Voices and Votes. The exhibit explores American democracy from the earliest of days of the Republic to today. It's free and open to the public from Tuesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And the last day the exhibit will be here on the Lincroft Brookdale campus is October 2nd. Although the Moms exhibit explores the national democracy story, the collaboration between Brookdale, the Monmouth Museum, and our community partners have given us an opportunity to explore Monmouth County's local history. The companion exhibits alone are well worth the visit. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Suffragists Speak, Race, Slavery, and the Fight for the Vote. This performance brings the struggle of the vote to life, with particular focus on the experience of African American women. This original stage reading gives voice to the moral questions and passionate commitments that drove individuals Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Alice Paul, and Ida B. Wells Barnett. It concludes with Fannie Lou Hamer's 1964 powerful account of voter suppression and makes clear that the fight for the vote did not end with the passage of the 19th Amendment. So it's my pleasure to introduce Peggy Dillinger, who will narrate this performance. Following the performance, we will have a question and answer session. So thank you all for being here today.
On August 18th, 1920, Harry Byrne, the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, broke the deadlock between pro- and anti-suffrage forces by casting his vote in favor of ratification of the 19th Amendment. It was an historic moment. Harry's vote carried the amendment over the finish line, making Tennessee the 36th and last state to ratify. 8 days later, women's suffrage became the law of the land, and overnight, the U.S. Constitution guaranteed 27 million American women the right to vote. It was the culmination of a fight that took more than 70 years to win, one that became the model for nonviolent protests that set the stage for the civil rights movement decades later. It is fitting to our program today that the most dramatic moment of the fight for women's suffrage took place in Tennessee, a southern state, the last one to join the Confederacy. The southern state that supplied more soldiers to the Union Army than all other Confederate states combined. Tennessee was divided by questions of race in the 19th century, and those questions were on hand 60 years later in its debate over suffrage. When Henry Byrne cast his decisive vote, he defied those in the Tennessee legislature who feared that enfranchising African American women would shift the balance of power in the South. Over the next hour, we're going to hear the voices of 6 historic figures whose experiences reflect the legacy of slavery and race as it played out in the fight for women's suffrage and beyond. Our first voices are those of Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, both now in their 70s. It's February 1895, and they meet before a women's convention at which Douglass is to speak. They are seeing each other after some absence, and they reflect on their decades-long friendship and the events that strained that friendship almost to breaking. Let me set the stage. At the time of our conversation, Douglass and Anthony are international celebrities. They had met when both were fighting to end slavery. Over time, Anthony's attention was drawn increasingly to women's rights, a cause that was also dear to Douglass, who considered himself a women's rights man. In the 1880s, women's rights didn't add up to much. Most doors to education were closed, professional careers were out of the question. When married women gave up their legal status, their wealth went to their husbands. Not only couldn't they vote, women, married or not, by custom were not even allowed to speak in public if men were present. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the fierce suffragist who became Anthony's soulmate, organized the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention to protest these conditions. It marked the start of the organized women's suffrage movement. Frederick Douglass was among the 300 men and women who attended. Stanton, Anthony, and Douglass were friends and allies, working tirelessly to end slavery and to win the vote. When the Civil War began, Anthony and Stanton drew their energies into the war effort. They helped win passage of the 13th Amendment ending slavery, and they expected that their efforts would be recognized. They weren't. The 15th Amendment guaranteed former male slaves the vote, but not women. The omission tested the Anthony Douglass friendship and caused a rift in the suffrage movement itself. Let's listen as Douglass and Anthony, together near the end of his life, reflect on this history.
Good morning, Mr. Douglass. Welcome.
And good morning to you, Miss Anthony. Thank you for your invitation to visit a while.
We will have tea soon, but first, let me enjoy this sight of you. It's been a good while since we last talked.
It has indeed. And I want to say how pleased I am that you will be escorting me tonight at the National Council of Women meeting. As I contemplate that moment, I have to ask, how's Mrs. Stanton doing?
She is not so well, and doing less traveling, or she would be with us tonight. She sends you greetings. She is my dearest friend, and I miss her, but we still, from time to time, write one more speech together. We've written so many, I've lost track of the number.
I do remember the first time I heard her speak, Seneca Falls in 1848. She astounded the crowd at the first women's rights movement meeting when she proposed a radical addition to several resolutions denouncing the wrongs visited upon women due to a defect of sex. Seeking redress, she proposed this addition. Resolved that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure for themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. I will never forget Lucretia Mott, who cried out, "Why, Lizzie, these will make us ridiculous. These go too fast." But it was clear that moving cautiously was not what Mrs. Stanton wanted, even though the crowd did not seem with her, and even her own husband left the meeting. I know you know this tale, although you were not there. But I like to remember that all of the men at that gathering, I was the only one who spoke in favor of the motion, and the only one who voted for it. It carried by a small majority. I know there have been times when you may not have believed this, but I feel strongly about suffrage for women. I have done little in this world in which to glory except this one act, and I certainly glory in that. When I ran away from slavery, it was for myself. When I advocated emancipation, it was for my people. But when I stood up for the rights of women, self was out of the question, and I found little nobility in the act.
I did question where you stood, especially in those years after the war, when our Congress proposed a 14th Amendment in which men were mentioned 3 times and women not at all. The 14th and 15th Amendments sorely tried that bond we had formed over the years. It was a bond built with countless miles traveled and local meetings held in support of the abolition of slavery. We even gave up work for suffrage to further the cause of abolition. Then, the 14th Amendment conferred citizenship upon the new freed men. But it sounded a warning for us women who generally favored Negro citizenship, but were troubled by the fact that the 14th Amendment referenced the right to vote of male citizens. Until then, the Constitution had not specifically excluded women from the vote. In fact, nowhere previously had there been any reference to sex in the Constitution. I admit that generally it was assumed that women would not vote. But we saw that the 14th Amendment would codify what had previously been custom alone. Many of us were distressed, even angered by the 14th Amendment's failure to mention women. And I still think with good cause. Remember, we stopped working for suffrage so we could work for abolition in the years leading up to the war. And women took an active part in the war effort. Remember Anna Ella Carroll, who devised the Tennessee River Strategy, for which General Grant took credit. There were only a few women doctors then, and a few nurses. But I know you remember Clara Barton organized efforts to care for wounded soldiers. And Harriet Tubman. Harriet headed the intelligence service of the Union in the South, as well as led troops into battle. It seemed to me that what these women did should have put an end for all time to the notion that women are inferior, but it did not, and we were left out. We felt betrayed, deserted by our Negro and abolitionist supporters when faced with the upcoming 15th Amendment addressing the right to the vote. Mrs. Stanton and I, and others working for women's rights, decided that if women were not offered the vote together with the newly freed men in that amendment, we would prevent its passage. We did not succeed.
Here are some things I knew, but could not say then. At least, I could not say them all. I supported women's suffrage. Nevertheless, I knew that a set of circumstances, the end of a great war, the assassination of President Lincoln, the struggle between Andrew Johnson and the radical Republican Congress, the fact that Southern states were out of the Union and could not be coerced into ratification as the price of readmission to the Union, all of these created a unique opportunity to enfranchise freedmen. The Northern states were either indifferent, having at the time too small a Negro population to pose any threat to their power structures, or Republican dominated and scenting the power of 2 million new, almost certain Republican voters. I also saw that the essential Northern states felt strongly about the propriety of women voting. They were not for it. And I felt that the inclusion of women's suffrage would result in the loss of the amendment denying the right to vote to women and Negro alike. The 15th Amendment was of overriding importance to the very survival of newly freed slaves. I felt only the ballot could shield them from the wrath of their former masters. Only the ballot could provide access to education. Only the ballot could guard their painfully worn economic foundations. Only the ballot could provide protection from the terrorist organizations that were springing up throughout the former Confederacy. You may remember the speech I gave in 1869 to the Equal Rights Association. When women, because they are women, are dragged from their houses and hung upon post lamps, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains bashed out on the pavement, when they are objects of insult and outrage at every turn, when they are in danger of having their houses burned down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot. And a voice shouted from the back, "Is that not true of black women?" And I replied, yes, it is true of black women, but not because she is a woman, but because she is black.
And around this time, I remember a debate that you and I had. Do you? I said, Mr. Douglas talks of the wrong of the Negro, but with all of the outrages that he today suffers, he would not exchange his sex and take the place of Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
And I said, I want to know if granting you the right of suffrage will change the nature of our sexes.
And I responded, it will change the pecuniary position of women. It will place her where she can earn her own bread. She will not then be driven to such employment only as man chooses for her. As I said those words then, and they still hold true, I thought of all the ways that women are denied the right to earn a living or to own property. Remember, once married, a husband can will away any property a wife brings to the marriage, even if it leaves her destitute. It reminded me of an earlier speech that I helped Mrs. Stanton write, where we noted that in the statute books, free men hold power over women like the feudal barons held over their vassals. We knew then, and today, that only the vote could free us from such servitude. You and I, we have seen injustice and have worked to change it, and still women are without the vote. And I know that in the South, the Negro has effectively lost the vote and struggles under a heavy yoke. Still, I believe that women will achieve the vote. There are new leaders rising, and a few Western states have enfranchised women. As to the South, perhaps women voting will help to tame the worst impulses of men.
The next day, Frederick Douglass died of a massive heart attack. Anthony stayed with his widow to help make the funeral arrangements, and she delivered a eulogy for her friend at his memorial service. While Anthony and Douglass were discussing the racial divide in the suffrage movement, African American women were living it. The experience of Black women in the fight for the vote has been at best underreported and for the most part ignored. From the start of the suffrage movement, African American women were there. They too spoke out, organized, and advocated. But they were both fighting for the vote and against the racial prejudices of a nation, including of the white suffragist movement. As African American activist Mary Church Terrell put it, they had the double burden of their Blackness and their womanhood. The suffragists were about to meet. Ida Wells Barnett, better known as Ida B. Wells, was one of those women. Wells Barnett challenged white suffragists who were ignoring the injustices against Black. Despite their disappointing response, she remained a staunch suffragist who organized African American women to fight for the vote and to end the racial prejudices that plagued their communities. Women's clubs, sororities, churches played a central role in this fight. They were the testing grounds for African American women to develop their leadership and advance their cause. Wells Barnett founded the first African American women's suffrage organization in Illinois. Her work laid the groundwork for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But let's invite Ida Wells Barnett herself to tell her story.
Most of you know my work as a journalist, pursuing the eradication of the national crime of lynching. I have written for many Negro newspapers across the country. Mississippi is where I was born, a slave, in 1862. And there I began my work as a teacher. At 16, after my 3 siblings and I became orphaned. The salary was too low as a teacher to support a family. Fortunately, I learned I could do better in Memphis, and we relocated there. Living in Memphis enabled me to take summer college courses to earn my teaching certificate. Riding to class in the ladies' car one Saturday morning, I was confronted by a conductor who insisted I move to the colored car. When I refused, he attempted to move me. I bit him. And at the next stop, he, another conductor, and the station master dragged me from my seat, and the men pulled me into the colored car. I was injured in the fracas and determined then and there to return a lawyer. On Christmas Eve of 1884, the circuit court ruled that I was wrongfully ejected from my seat and ordered the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad to pay me $500 in damages. At 22, I had struck a blow against Tennessee's first Jim Crow law. Of course, that was not the end of the story. The railroad's attorney threatened me and promised they would appeal to the state Supreme Court, which of course they did. And the court overturned the verdict, saying that I had intended to harass the C&O company. They ordered me to pay $200 in court costs. I was so disappointed. I had hoped great things for my suit, for my people. I had believed all along that the law was on our side and would give us justice when we appealed to it. Justice I saw was not intended to be ours, even when we fought and won. This case sparked a rage against injustice that remains with me. And while the verdict broke my heart, it toughened my spirit. I continued teaching, but I knew I was ready for another career. So in 1884, I accepted an invitation to write a column for the Memphis Evening Star. A few years later, I wrote my first story for the Free Speech, covering the murder and lynching of 3 Memphis shopkeepers, one a dear friend. My career as a crusading journalist had begun. I created a campaign against lynching, which many white Americans considered appropriate punishment for any Negro who allegedly committed any crime, great or small. I was writing accounts of lynching and making it clear that the victims were being denied a fair and speedy trial, a right to which every citizen is entitled. In addition to my writing, I had started speaking engagements in many states, and I made my first trips abroad to lecture, garnering support to end a practice many here at home accepted as normal. I hoped British audiences would see that Americans would not see. The tragic, shameful torture, maiming, and murder of its American citizens, its Negro American citizens. Many of you are aware of the burning of my newspaper offices in Memphis and the murder of my associates. Since then, I have not returned to the South. No, I learned armed vigilantes were waiting my return. My fellow friend and editor, T. Thomas Fortune, offered me a full-time position at his newspaper, the New York Age. I declined, but continued my writing and speaking engagements across the country. While I was immersed in the horror of covering lynchings, writing pamphlets, and speaking, I became more and more aware of the significance of voting and electing those who could change Jim Crow laws and speak out against lynching. Only the power of the vote could do that. The 15th Amendment brought the ballot to Negro men, not any women. Despite the amendment, Negro men face so many obstacles to vote that they might as well not even have the right. So, my work as a suffragist is grounded in the need for the vote to be extended to all men and all women without reservation. Remember, ladies, our cause is the same.
As events continued to unfold, the black and white paths to women's suffrage remained separate. By the turn of the 20th century, the white icons of suffrage were in their 80s and ready to pass the baton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton died in 1902, Susan B. Anthony, 1906. Aunt Susan, as Anthony became known to the young activist, spent the last years of her life grooming the next generation of white suffragists. Among that next generation was New Jersey's own Alice Paul, born in 1885 in Mount Laurel. Paul, like Susan B. Anthony, was a Quaker, a group that had long stood for the equality of all beings. Paul studied in England after graduating from Swarthmore and later earned a doctoral and a law degree. While in England, Alice Paul joined the militant British suffrage movement. She organized, marched, and was arrested multiple times. In prison, she joined the hunger strikes of her fellow suffragists, as they were called in England, and endured the tortures of force feeding. Paul returned to the United States in 1910, ready to take up the suffrage cause here with the passion and activism she'd learned from her British mentors. But what she found was a national suffrage movement that had lost its momentum. Its tactics were conservative. Its enthusiasm was waning. It was focused on waging state-by-state campaigns to win suffrage, and it hadn't won a state in years. Paul had no patience for this. She joined the National Suffrage Organization and immediately began arguing for a federal amendment and radical headline-grabbing tactics. Her first big splash was the 1913 Women's Suffrage Procession, a high-profile, nationally covered 5,000-woman parade in Washington, D.C. on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's first inauguration. The march was a big deal. Women traveled to the Capitol from across the country. The police failed to provide the requested protection, and hecklers in the crowd harassed and injured marchers. Pictures of the assaults and the pageantry made the papers across the nation. It was just the buzz and the shot in the arm that Paul intended. But behind the scenes, there was a complication Paul did not intend. In the lead up to the march, political realities were vying with moral principles, and the complex question of race was once again on the table. Alice Paul was confronted with a moral decision that, as it turns out, will bring Ida Wells Barnett back on stage. Let's imagine Alice Paul as she struggles with this race question in an imagined letter to her sister. It's 1913, days before the grand suffrage procession.
Oh, dear sister, please hear me out. I am in a quandary. A decision is being forced upon us regarding our march, and in making it, I must find a balance between our Quaker heritage and the realities of today. The matter about whether colored women are welcome in our procession has come up again, and right on the eve of our march. In early January, when someone first inquired about this, we thought that not many Negro women would want to participate. So we said yes, a few might be tucked among friendly women from the North, and they would not be very noticeable. Later, a woman wrote to our journal asking whether Negro women could march. And then I began to worry that the question might be publicized. What if a majority of white marchers were to say that they refused to participate if Negroes in any number formed a part of the parade? But as a Quaker, I am predisposed to side with and not against the Negro in any question of racial difference. But racist feelings in Washington have been very bitter this winter. I am worried that we must have a white march or a Negro march or no march at all. I thought it would be best to say nothing about the question because we wanted to keep it out of the newspapers. At first, the editor agreed. Then one of the national officers heard about this, and she was very upset. She wrote to me that we could not even think of turning down an application from colored women. The suffrage movement has to stand for enfranchising every single woman in the country, both black and white. But still, I worried, especially when we received a stream of inquiries. Just recently, I heard from a group of young women at a colored sorority here. They want to march in the college section. I delayed answering, thinking that there were only a dozen or so, and perhaps they would not be noticed. Other groups of Negro women will be at the end of the procession. But then today I learned that there is a colored woman in Chicago who wants to march with the Illinois delegation. It's probably that Mrs. Barnett who has fought so fiercely against slave lynching. What are we to say? If Mrs. Barnett will not march at the end of the procession, But does she not know how much her insistence could damage all that we are working for? So many women from all over the country have worked so hard to make this grand procession a success. Our floats, our music, our banners, even our disputes, we have managed to keep them from becoming public. But this woman from Chicago, she's a journalist. If she objects to marching at the end of the procession, she will probably talk to the newspapers. And oh, we do not want that. But, dear sister, in saying this, am I being unfaithful to our heritage? As Quakers, we have long struggled for the equality of all. We fought to free our colored brethren from the oppression of slavery. Now our black brothers can vote along with our white brothers. And when our campaign for women's suffrage is finally successful, our black sisters will be able to vote along with the rest of us. Can that Chicago woman not understand this? Would she doom our campaign? The colored women have their rights, and our family has helped to fight for them. But what of the other women, those who do not agree with their rights? Must I not support them as well? And will any of us, Mrs. Barnett herself, or our other sisters in the South, both the colored women and the rest, benefit by endangering the success of our cause?
Alice Paul made her decision. The suffrage procession was held on March 3rd, 1913, and her instructions were that the African American suffragists should march at the end of the parade. But that's not the end of the story. Let's listen to Ida Wells Barnett, that Chicago woman, tell us how she responded to Alice Paul's instructions.
The end? The end, you say? Behind the white women? The Negro women should march alone at the end of the parade? That is your thinking, your solution? That we should be pushed back, hidden, an afterthought? That would, what would even make you think that would be acceptable to us? Yes, it would make it seem like we're not part of you, not part of this effort. Oh, is that it? You think we hurt your cause. Foolish. Is it not the same cause, the same goal? No matter what color we are, men refuse to let us have the right to vote. We're all women. When the 15th Amendment was passed, it was lost to us all. It was as lost to you as it was to me. And you think it important to secure your suffrage before ours? We reject that. Yes, all men have the right to vote. But in the case of Negro men, not the means. Oh, yes. I know some of you agree that we are all sisters in the struggle, but not all of your ranks agree. The majority of your Southern members wish to have nothing to do with us. Our presence in the fight and this parade will ruin white women's desire to vote. Clearly, this organization holds that view the same. I see that you hold the separation higher than the desire to vote, higher than the need to stand tall and face down tyranny together. No, I will march with the Illinois delegation, and the Southerners be damned if they don't like it. You should know, the Alfred Suffrage Club of Chicago was formed by Negro women and 2 white women. And the white women were relegated neither to the front nor the back. We marched together, side by by side. You all know of my anti-lynching work and my crusading journalism to expose its horrors, as well as to press for legislation to make lynching a crime anywhere in the United States of America. Yes, the work of gaining the vote is a lever to be used against lynching. People who are free and able to vote can lift a nation beyond what keeps it mired in hatred for its black citizens. You stood with us as we pushed to abolish slavery so that everyone could be free. And I believe, as I think you do, that a country with a free citizenry can exercise its power to vote and change things. We must believe that is so. Else, why are we here? The Alfred Suffrage Club and the Women's Second Ward Republican Club are anti-lynching and pro-suffrage organizations. Any white women who see fit to join us, do so as equals, not superiors. Susan B. Anthony once tried to convince me that when women get the vote, everything will change. And with Negro and white women working together, well, I think it might be possible. But if we are to be relegated to the rear anytime someone fears their cause will be lost, then I'm afraid I cannot be convinced. No, I will not dress up prejudice and call it politics, nor will I allow anyone else to do so. I will march with the Illinois delegation, or not at all. And believe you me, I intend to march.
Ida Wells Barnett marched, and she marched with her fellow suffragists in the white Illinois delegation. Alice Paul, the moving force behind the 1913 women's suffrage procession and towering figure in the fight for the 19th Amendment, had a rival in the movement. The conservative state-by-state strategy that so frustrated Paul on her return from England was spearheaded by Harriet Tubman Catt, Susan B. Anthony's hand-picked successor to run the traditional national suffrage organization. As leaders of the 20th century wave of the movement, Paul and Catt ran two separate, parallel campaigns with different focus and different tactics. Paul was militant and aggressive, focused on high-profile, Washington-targeted strategies for a federal suffrage amendment. She took the fight directly to President Wilson. She and her supporters picketed, served jail time, refused to eat, endured forced feeding. Harriet Tubman Catt skillfully masterminded a less strident but equally determined campaign to gain the vote one state at a time. A federal amendment requires 2/3 of both houses of Congress to pass the proposed language and 3/4 of the states to ratify, state legislature by state legislature. Clearly, the power for change rested with the states. Each has 2 senators, regardless of its size, and each has an equal voice in ratification, regardless of its size. And in the U.S. in 1920, as still today, there were and remain stark regional differences among the states. Those differences intruded their way directly and painfully into the fight for the vote. The southern states feared the enfranchisement of African American women, and ratification required the support of at least some of those southern states. Both Alice Paul and Harriet Catt were challenged to win those southern legislators to the cause. As Frederick Douglass had calculated that adding women to the 15th Amendment would jeopardize its ratification, now the white suffragists made a similar moral compromise in wooing the racist factions in the South. Let's return to where we started, Nashville, 1920. Catt was there. Paul stayed away, knowing that her controversial tactics would make her a lightning rod as the ratification debate in the last state played out. We're about to imagine the thoughts passing through the mind of Carrie Catt, now a global personality, an acknowledged titan of suffrage, as she celebrates the outcome of the vote in Tennessee and reflects on what it took to get there.
It came down to this. The state of Tennessee was our last hope. Congress had passed the women's suffrage amendment, and 35 states had ratified it. One more state would take us to the 3/4 required by the Constitution. But 8 states had already defeated the amendment. That left only 5. We had no chance in North Carolina and Florida, and we knew it. In Connecticut and Vermont, the governors refused to call a special legislative session to consider the amendment. That left only Tennessee. Tonight, the political fate of the women of the nation rested in the hands of a minority of a single state legislative chamber. The moment was intensely dramatic. Every onlooker knew that the fate of the question might depend upon a single vote. When young Harry Byrne cast his vote for women's suffrage, the House broke into an uproar, and the cheers of triumph that rang through the old legislative chamber were heard far down the street. The Woman's Suffrage Amendment, introduced in Congress in 1878, when I was but 19, will now become the law of the land. So, how did we finally reach this point? My plan, I called it the winning plan, was to organize in the states. And in Tennessee, we surely organized. Listen to how we did it. The women of Tennessee laid aside their political differences and worked in a manner worthy of imitation by the men of the state. The southern summer heat was merciless, and many legislators lived in remote villages or on farms miles from any town. Yet the women trailed these legislators by train, by motor, by wagons, and on foot, often in great discomfort, frequently at considerable expense to themselves. They went without meals, were drenched in unexpected rains, and met with tire troubles, yet no woman faltered. And there was not a legislator who had not been visited by his women constituents before the legislature met. Other suffrage leaders followed different paths. You've heard from one of them, Alice Paul, who organized parades and protests and was even jailed to draw attention to the suffrage cause. My path, as I said, was to organize in the states, but even more, to bring the struggle for suffrage to states where we could win. And in addition, in those states, we needed to choose arguments that could win. So yes, when I campaigned in the South, I did say white supremacy would be strengthened, not weakened, by women's suffrage. And I told them why. Here are the numbers. In the 15 states south of the Mason-Dixon line, the total Negro population is 8,294,274. But the total population of white women is 8,788,901. White women outnumber both Negro males and females by nearly 500,000. If the South really wants white supremacy, it will urge the enfranchisement of women. Yes, I did say those words, and I compiled those numbers for our Southern brethren. But listen to this and hear me now. The South professes to fear the increased Negro vote. The North, the increased foreign vote. The rich, the increased labor vote. The conservative, the increased illiterate vote. Certain elements fear the increased Catholic vote, and still others, the increased Jewish vote. Ballot reformers fear the increased corrupt vote, and corruptionists fear the increased reform vote. Ridiculous as this list of objections may appear, each has been supported earnestly by a considerable group, and collectively they have furnished the basis of opposition to women's suffrage in and out of Congress. but the answer to one is the answer to all. Government by the people is expedient, or it is not. If it is expedient, then obviously all the people must be included. The struggle for women's suffrage is no white woman's struggle, but every woman's struggle. Everybody counts in applying democracy, and there will never be a true democracy until every law-abiding adult in it, without regard to race, sex, color, or creed, has his or her inalienable voice in government.
Carrie Catt took us up to Nashville, August 1920, where the 72-year fight to ended with the Tennessee's ratification of the 19th Amendment, and she left us with stirring words on the meaning of democracy. But the fight for suffrage didn't end for everyone in 1920. African American women continued to bear the double burden of their blackness and their womanhood. Jim Crow laws, with their poll taxes, literacy tests, and tolerance of intimidation and violence against African Americans, continue to deprive Black women and Black men of their vote. Fannie Lou Hamer, our next player, knew this intimidation firsthand. She was the youngest of 20 children, born in Mississippi in 1917. She lived the outrages of racial violence, including undergoing sterilization without her consent during a surgery to remove a uterine tumor. In 1962, outraged by efforts to deny Blacks the vote, she turned her attention and formidable talents to voters' rights. She became a political organizer and a powerful voice in the civil and voting rights movements. By 1964, Hamer had a national reputation. She co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and challenged the pro-segregation state Democratic Organization. She led her group to the 1964 Democratic National Presidential Convention in Atlantic City and asked to be recognized as official delegates. We're about to hear Hamer's speech to that credentials committee. Television coverage of her appearance was preempted by a press conference called by President Lyndon Johnson to deprive her of a live national audience, but Hamer got the last word. Her speech, televised later, was seen by millions and helps build support for her cause. The 1964 Credentials Committee denied Hamer and her group delegate status, but 4 years later, in 1968, Fannie Lou Hamer served as a member of Mississippi's first integrated delegation to the Democratic National Convention. Let's hear Hamer's 1964 speech and the words that laid the groundwork for the 1965 Voters' Rights Act 1 year later.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee, my name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and I live at 626 East Lafayette Street, Ruleville, Mississippi, Sunflower County, the home of Senator James O. Eastland and Senator Stennis. It was the 31st of August, 1962, that 18 of us traveled 26 miles to the county courthouse in Indianola to try to register to become first-class citizens. We was met in Indianola by policemen, highway patrolmen, and they only allowed 2 of us in to take the literacy test at a time. After we had taken this test and started back to Ruleville, we was held up by the city police and the state highway patrolmen and carried back to Indianola, where the bus driver was charged that day for driving a bus the wrong color. After we paid the fine among us, we continued on to Ruleville, and Reverend Jeff Sonny carried me 4 miles in the rural area where I had worked as a timekeeper and sharecropper for 18 years. I was met there by my children, who told me the plantation owner was angry because I'd gone down and tried to register. After they told me that, my husband said the plantation owner was raising Cain because I had tried to register. And before he quit talking, the plantation owner came and he said, "Fannie Lou, do you know, did Pap tell you what I said?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, I mean that. If you don't go down and withdraw that registration, you will have to leave. Then if you go down and withdraw, you still might have to go because we're not ready for that in Mississippi." And I addressed him and I said, "I didn't try to register for you. I tried to register for myself." I had to leave that night. On the 10th of September, 1962, 16 bullets was fired into the home of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Tucker. For me, that same night, 2 girls were shot in Ruleville, Mississippi. Also, Mr. Joe McDonald's house was shot in. On June 9th, 1963, I had attended a voter registration workshop and was returning back to Mississippi. 10 of us was traveling on the Continental Trailways bus. It was a state highway patrolman and a chief of police ordered us out. I was carried to the county jail and put in the booking room. They left some of the people in the booking room and began to put us in cells. I was placed in a cell with a young woman called Miss Ivesta Simpson. After I was placed in the cell, I began to hear sounds of licks and screams. I could hear the sounds of licks and horrible screams, and I could hear somebody say, "Can you say yes, sir, nigga? Can you say yes, sir?" And they would say other horrible names. She would say, "Yes, I can say yes, sir." "So, well, say it." She said, "I don't know you well enough." They beat her, I don't know how long. And after a while, she began to pray and ask God to have mercy on these people. And it wasn't too long before 3 white men came to my cell. One of these men was a state highway patrolman, and he asked me where I was from. I told him Ruleville. He said, "We're going to check that out." And they left my cell, and it wasn't long before they came back. He said, "You are from Ruleville, all right." And he used a curse word. And he said, "We're going to make you wish you was dead." I was carried out of that cell into another cell where they had 2 Negro prisoners. The state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro to take the blackjack. The first Negro prisoner ordered me, by orders from the state highway patrolman, for me to lay down on the bunk bed on my face. And I laid on my face, and the first Negro began to beat me. And I was beat by the first Negro until he was exhausted. I was holding my hands behind me at that time on my left side because I had suffered from polio when I was 6 years old. After the first Negro had beat me until he was exhausted, the state highway patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack. The second Negro began to beat me, and I began to work my feet. And the highway patrolman ordered the first Negro who had beat me to sit on my feet, to keep me from working my feet. I began to scream, and one white man got up and he began to beat me in my head and tell me to hush. One white man, my dress had worked up high, he walked over and he pulled my dress up. I pulled my dress down, he pulled my dress back up. You know, I was in jail when Medgar Evers was murdered. All of this is on account of we want to register to vote, to become first-class citizens. And if the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily? Because we want to live as decent human beings in America. Thank you.
Our suffragists have spoken. Their stories cast a light on the history of the fight for the vote that has remained in the shadows. For many of us, the story of suffrage was one of a hard-fought and noble movement that marched slowly but inevitably to victory, of undaunted women and men who risked ridicule and even harm for the cause. It was this, and it was more. The battle was fierce, but it was also flawed, and it still is. It's well over half a century since Fannie Lou Hamer's powerful remarks to the Credentials Committee at the 1964 Democratic Convention, but attempts to suppress the vote haven't stopped. Voter rolls are being purged to disenfranchise some populations. Districts are closing polling places to create long waits in certain neighborhoods, and more. We need to pay attention. And we need to continue to protect the right to vote for everyone. And more than anything, we need to register and vote. I'd like to introduce you to our cast, if they would come up, please. Marion Wattenbarger as Susan B. Anthony, Arthur Gregory Pugh, I'm so sorry, as Frederick Douglass, and especially acknowledging Arthur because he stepped in to be our Frederick Douglass at the last minute, since our original Frederick Douglass is out of the country. Lorraine Stone as Ida B. Wells, Connie Goddard as Alice Paul, and Tori Beebe as Carrie Chapman Catt, and I'm Peggy Dellinger, your narrator. Oh, I forgot Gilda. Unforgettable. Unforgettable, Gilda. She was, okay, I'm sorry, my apologies. How could one forget such a powerful performance? Gilda Rogers as Fannie Lou Hamer.
Can you stand next to them so I can get a group shot, please?
We would like to entertain any questions that you have of the cast or about the story, about the process, about where the material came from.
I'm going to open up the chat, so.
Thank you, While they're doing that, could you tell us a little bit about the organizations that you represent and how they are connected to voter rights and those sorts of things? Go on in there.
First, I have to have my picture
Yeah.
taken.
We move the mic away from the
project started in 2019, I believe, in anticipation of the centennial celebration of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. And it was a collaboration that kind of sprang spontaneously between the League of Women Voters of Monmouth County, the AAUW Northern Monmouth County branch, the T. Thomas Fortune Cultural Center in Red Bag. Are you familiar with that? Yes. Okay. And we worked to put together, we wrote the materials using the words of the actual historical characters to the extent that we could, and then we wove them together into the narrative that you've just seen. And we were hit by COVID. We did one live, this is our second live performance, because we did it for the first time on the cusp of Black History Month and Women's History Month in 2020. So I think it was like March 1st. Yeah. And the world shut down a week later. Yeah. Right? It wasn't our fault. Correct. And so we gathered together grant money and support, and were able to get our performance professionally videotaped. So it is available free of charge to any organization, nonprofit, and school, and members of the cast will make themselves available to be present at the end of the Zoom presentation and answer questions and lead discussion.
And one thing I might note is that we know to date that at least close to 1,000 people, because we can document that from the Zoom, have used the video, seen the video, and with at least close to 300 of them, we've also engaged in post-performance, conversations. So we hope that it continues to be shared, because we think it's a story that's too little known.
If any of you are motivated to want to introduce this to an organization you belong to or a school, you just visit suffragistspeak@gmail.com, and Connie monitors that account, and we'll get back to you.
I'd like to open it up to any questions on the chat. I have very good friends of mine that are attending right now: Anne Marie, Debbie, Jeanette, Margine, Regina, and Susan. Would you like to ask any questions? Please put them in the chat for us. And while we're waiting on that, I just want to make a couple of announcements for the upcoming events. So on September 27th, next week, from 4:30 to 6:30 in the Student Life Center Twin Lights Room 1, Brookdale alumni, Monmouth County YMCA board member, and American Friends Service Committee on National Legislation in Red Bank Advocacy Corps organizer Itzel Perez Hernandez will give a presentation on the political history of DACA and advanced parole, highlighting how non-citizens have been and can be powerful actors in our democratic process. It is a collaboration between the Smithsonian Planning Committee, the Campus Club Dreamers, and the Brookdale International Center. And on September 28th, in this room, Man 105, from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m., will be a special presentation by author and historian, our very own professor of history, Jane Semeka, will present on the impact that Geraldine Livingston Thomas had on our community and a bit about her enthralling life story. So I'm just going to check if anybody, I don't see any questions in the chat. If anybody would like, oh, I see, I'm so sorry. Anne-Marie Johnson said, great job. Thank you very much for sharing your performance with us.
I just wanted to point out that we had no idea when we were putting this together, first of all, that COVID would change our lives so profoundly, but also that 2 years, more than 2 years later, close to 2 years later, we would be dealing with voter suppression issues that would be so timely. We were kind of concerned in the beginning, we had all of the momentum of the celebration of the 19th Amendment and the relevance to audiences based on that. But I think we all believe that the relevance of this material lives on, and right now more powerfully in the face of the things that are going on in this country to suppress the vote.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, hi, Roseanne. I was actually going to ask you the cast members about that. It was so powerful. And I was listening to Fannie kind of mainstreaming of white supremacy. As we noted, this reinvigoration, voter suppression. I was actually just talking to my class earlier about how what we're working on now seems just so much more important than the 21 years that I've taught this continent. And I was just wondering if, like, you who spoke these words and the cast members, like, any reflections on that? About, like, what this meant for you and reflecting?
I teach history, so this is all relevant for us right now, in this moment. So this moment right now, for those of us who have lived long enough to understand where things were and where they are now, it's like mirroring something, and it's really, it's really scary. So this information selling right now is really important for young people to hear and to be made aware of what is really taking place right in this moment in front of their, eyes, that we need to make sure we're voting, that they're participating. Young people, whether you are of age to vote or not, there are things that you can do. And I could go into it because I'm having my students do a project so that they understand that they have the power to enact change. But you have to get involved. You have to get involved. You can't do it from the backseat, backseat driver.
I would say, as an actor and someone who does historical portrayals, I am careful never to say, oh, well, if Ida was here today, she would say, I won't do that. But I can go back into Ida B. Wells' life as I have discovered it through my research. One thing that Ida B. Wells was very strong about was stepping up, speaking up, and doing something. And that is something I think I can pass on to all of us. We have to stand up, we have to step up, we have to do something. I was talking to my niece last, Saturday, and, okay, I need to leave. She said, well, I'm just thinking about voting Republican because I don't know what else to do. I don't know what's going on. I said, well, you need to, whoever you're going to vote for, you need to take the time and really understand what they stand for. What will they offer you if they become your representative? You need to know that, but she really couldn't see any difference. She didn't think it made any difference. So I am not supposed to stand here and tell anybody to vote Democratic or Republican. But I will say our young people are confused a lot. Honey, a lot of old people are confused about this stuff. So we need to step up and speak. We don't have to tell you who to vote for, but we have to tell you to be clear. You have a voice, use your voice. You're not sure, get some information. We got the internet, you can Google anything and anybody. We can do it. League of Women Voters has all kinds of information. We need to come alive, get involved, and step up. That's what I'd say.
I'd just like to point out some comments online because you can't see these, and I want to acknowledge the people that are out there. Dr. Susie Wyman, who is a member on our foundation board. Thank you for your passionate readings that added so much force to your performance. Anne Marie Johnson, her mom is watching also, so is mine. Anne Marie, she really liked how informative it was. For Professor Debbie Mura, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Would a video of this presentation be made available so that we can use it in our classes? Absolutely. And also the professional video that they have as well is located in our library resources. And Regina, I'm glad I was able to catch some of the performance. Thank you all for your contribution.
like to just make a comment in response to, yeah, I think it is very easy these days to be discouraged, particularly as we look at how hateful some of what's going on in our country is. But one of the things I think it's really important, and this is really, to some extent, really echoing what Lorraine said, is, first of all, I think she had the conversation with somebody, and I think it's important for us to have some of those conversations that we think might be uncomfortable, but if the subject comes up, you know, we need to sometimes engage in conversations that we think are uncomfortable. And I think the power of the vote, one of the stories I remember from several years ago is hearing somebody who made a comment to the effect that basically somebody said about in voting, think about who gets appointed to the courts, and particularly in that case, the Supreme Court. And a person responded with, oh, it doesn't make any difference, we can vote them out of office in a couple of years. You don't understand how our system works if you think you can vote, you know, a level of judges out of office. So I think it's incumbent on all of us, if we think we at least have a pretty good handle on how it works, to perhaps engage in conversations, not as adversaries, but as, you know, here's important information, because if you understand how that works, that might affect how you make a decision about who you vote for. So I am grateful for those of you who were here and joined us by Zoom, because I think it says something about what you care about, but also that we do engage in the way that Lorraine, I think, was speaking to. But that one example has stuck with me about what we don't always understand about the effect of our vote.
I want to say something that, I don't know whether it was Lorraine's comment or Gilda's comment that brought this to mind, but also, yes, leadership, what Ida B. Wells stood up for, but most of us don't have, maybe whatever, but also joint organizations, the League of Women Voters, the AAUW. There are other groups that, and there are young people's groups too, that together we are stronger than alone. And I think that's also immensely important, that we learn to work together. And that's how we affect change.
If I were to answer the question, how did it affect me personally? I have to admit that it affects me personally every time I listen to the Suffragists. And I tell you, I've heard them more than once. And yet every time I am moved by it. And one of the things that is so striking is the courage and the commitment that these characters and many others had just to vote. I mean, as Fannie Lou says so powerfully, what she was willing to do just to register to vote, just to become a full-class citizen. And it is so infuriating that we are, in this country, we turn out for presidential elections more than any other, and yet at the most it's like 62%. And I think the last one was a little higher than 62, but still in the 60s. I mean, what we're talking about, right, is that, 3 out of, whatever that, you do the math. 3 out of every 5, 2 out of every 5, right, are not voting in the face of what we are going through right now, when we can think that it's 50 plus 60 years since Fannie Lou was tortured, prematurely ending her life, the tortures that Gilda described to us. She died at 57. 57, and the speculation is that it was due to the abuse she took. Why? Because she wanted to vote. That people were willing to give their lives and did give their lives, and yet 2 out of every 5 people in this country do not vote. And so I think, I guess one of the things that motivated us in putting this project together was try to ignite some passion and some respect for what the right to vote represents and the sacrifices that have been made for that right. And so, you know, it's a frustration, but we're doing our best.
I hate to follow Peggy because I'm so passionate, but I want to say that cynicism is not the answer. You know, you might have heard that from your niece. And, you know, when I think I'm not a historian, so I, you know, really struggled to learn the story of Carrie Catt, and I found it very hard to voice those two completely different sentiments, that she could speak on the one hand about white supremacy and on the other about the importance of including everyone. But it's, you know, that's to me, that's the moral ambiguity of America. And we don't have to be afraid of it. We need to embrace it, not be cynical about it, if possible. Easy for me to say. And stay focused on staying involved, having our voice heard, voting.
But we have to confront it. We have to confront the white supremacy that is raging. I mean, we can't act like it's not happening, because it is. It's loud and clear. It's out in our face. It's not even being hidden. It is like, yeah, here we are. So now what are you going to do about it? And what we can do is vote to get these politicians who are backing white supremacists out of office, you know, and to have people in office who care about this country, who really care. Because from what we've seen, you know, from the last administration, you can't say that no one can convince me that they care. Care about what? You know, wreaking havoc. They don't care about a democracy where all people are included. You know, look at the mean-spiritedness of what they did with those people that they sent to Martha's Vineyards. Martha's Vineyards and to New York City, busloads.
Human trafficking.
Yes.
Literally what it is.
One more comment.
I just want to right now. A little footnote that
22.
I could not believe it when I saw it on the news. I thought it was abominable.
Yeah, I just need to make sure that we establish that this is a nonpartisan
We are all
sorry. Yes.
One more comment that I want to read. Jeanette Bellatico, September is Natural Voters Registration Month. As I am listening, I am working on an article for Brookdale student newspaper, The Current, regarding why vote. Mary Lou Hamer brought me to the moment, to the experience of why we need to register to vote. Thank you.
I think one of the things that, as we represent our organizations, we do represent them as nonpartisan. But I think our message is, it's so important that you know who you're voting for, why you're voting, and that it's important to make that vote. If you stay out of it, then you haven't had your voice heard. So, and I think it's also the other thing is that is to engage in conversation with folks, and at least it's a really challenging time, but as respectfully as we can, sometimes engage in conversations with people we don't agree with, you know, in the attempt to both listen but maybe be heard too. So I think this is really challenging. Thank you.
May I just add, I believe this is the first time that Arthur has heard this outside his piece. So I just thought maybe your perspective would be
I learned a lot going through the whole process, and as an actor, I always feel it's just as important to educate as it is to entertain. And this complete piece is full education, full knowledge, where it gives you insight, it gives you the ability to think, it gives you thought in itself in terms of knowing what's right, what's wrong, and doing the right thing in society and making things happen to make this place a better place.
Thank you all.
Thank you for hosting us.
I'm off the house.
Okay, Danine, you can end it. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you.